Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everybody. I'm glad to be here as always. I'm glad you're here too. I wanted to talk a little bit tonight about um, a process that we see sometimes in our own clients, sometimes especially I see when I do the alumni groups or sometimes the questions here, and that is people kind of moving in a very slow and sometimes a little faster way, but back toward relapse. And I think it's really useful. I borrowed a concept from smart recovery, which is another kind of recovery that looks more at the cognitive aspects of recovery. But they have a term which I really like. They call it backward steps toward addictive behavior. So in other words, we're moving from our recovery kind of into back, kind of slipping, losing territory, moving backwards into relapse. And they've broken it down to 5 things just to be alert to and be careful of. And I thought it's really useful to go over those. And just remember that recovery is a process. So it takes steps, it takes commitment, it takes day after day of working on it. But relapse is often a process too. Once in a while somebody will have a flash and maybe a text or something, they get it, and boom, they're gone. But in most cases, it's kind of this slower process toward relapse where there's observable steps, and if we see it and recognize it, we can intervene on ourselves or on our friends. So I just want to kind of go over some of the steps and what they are. The first is triggers, right? And we always talk about triggers and cravings. We've talked about the external triggers, those are people, places, things out there, sounds, by the way, with dopamine, the high dopamine content of all these super stimulants like sex and porn and amphetamines. We have triggers and cravings everywhere in our environment beyond what I've seen in other addictions. So it's just that strong dopamine just creates links and triggers almost everywhere. And that takes time to kind of unwind those. We also have the interpersonal triggers when we're talking with someone, especially our spouse, if there's been some rancor there that can trigger us to use. And then also even more troubling sometimes the internal triggers, the sensations, the thoughts, the feelings that kind of are bubbling up inside me. And that can be a problem as well. So I think it's useful just to think about some of these. So conditioned response to sensations, right? Conditioned responses to emotion. In other words, we have learned how to adapt when we get uncomfortable feelings, and by the way, not just comfortable, sometimes when we have happy, pleasant feelings, we're also equally triggered to act out. And sometimes if we're bored, really kind of no triggers, no sensations in our environment, we can actually move toward using at that point too. Having pressure from others, having conflict, socializing. A lot of us are kind of at the end, before we get in recovery, I think are kind of withdrawn from society in many ways. And we may be interacting with people, but we're very much in our head. And so I think just all these kind of processes and interactions and triggers can be problematic. So there's one more that we don't often talk about there, and Smart Recovery identified it, and that's testing personal control. I was like, and I remember I've had meth clients. Well, they are in recovery, but in an old coat they hadn't worn in 5 months, and they find a little bit. And I remember one client saying, "I'm going to keep it in my freezer just to prove that I don't have to use it." Not a good idea, right? Also, a lot of sex and porn addicts will have a whole bunch of stuff on their phone: contacts, pictures, videos, all kinds of stuff. And it's really risky for any one individual to go through that on their own. It's highly triggering. And it's a really highly sensation. So again, testing personal control. If you're going to dig, and I recommend cleaning up your phone, obviously, but do it with somebody else, or have somebody else do it while you're there. It's extremely triggering. I think we underestimate the power of that. The second one is euphoric recall, right? We start thinking about the good times, and only the good times, by the way. The whole definition of euphoric recall is that we kind of ignore, or we're blind, or kind of have a little bit of memory loss about the consequences and how feeling sick or getting in trouble, or feeling the shame, feeling the remorse, just getting the ticket, leading to a separation, all that stuff that happens. And this is part of just the addictive process and how strong it is in our brains. It really kind of filters that out. So we're focused on the good stuff. And then when we're in that kind of preoccupied state on our way to acting out, we only see that stuff. CSATs do a technique called fantasy contamination, which is walking with a client into that fantasy, which is really kind of a high risk intervention, I think. But for somebody who really needs to kind of what we try to do with fantasy contamination is we pop a pin on that bubble. We walk in and say, well, let's take a realistic look at this fantasy. What would happen if you did this? What about that? Is that really how it's going to be? And we kind of just walk through and ruin it. Obviously, that is triggering for people, and I never recommend doing that unless you're really stable and do it with the CSAT as well. But it's that important. Euphoric recall is something we all experience in recovery, and I think it's really important to think it through, to remember, to talk about it. And after all, we can do this self-correcting if we choose to, right? We remember the other parts as well as the good parts. But when they're in that, when we've already kind of decided, and I think that's the underlying pretense of a lot of these things I'm suggesting tonight, is that at some point in our brain, we've decided we're going to go out and use or act out again. And we may not even be conscious of that yet, but we start doing these things. And so that's why the behaviors and the observation and awareness of them are so important. So we have the triggers, we had euphoric recall. What Smart Recovery calls unhelpful thinking. And these are things we've talked about in other webinars here, things like cognitive errors, irrational beliefs, rationalizations to convince ourselves that we're not getting in trouble. So that may be when we talk about cognitive errors, it's a frame, a filter, which we see the world and we kind of interpret events. And so sometimes we can catastrophize, right? Everything's just terrible, or we minimize. It's not so bad. I had a little cocaine. It's not meth. So we can rationalize, we can minimize, we can catastrophize, which gives us sometimes permissions, like everything's terrible anyway. I can just go out and act out. There's many others too in terms of natural belief. Self-denigration, right? Putting ourselves down all the time can be a sign of that. Rationalizing, minimizing, black and white thinking. Well, it's either this or it's that, and no gray area in between. So I can get abstinent and not use drugs or sex and just have an uninteresting or boring or no sex life at all, or have to go into recovery. It's like, it doesn't make sense. So we have to kind of think about the real situation there with that black and white thinking. Things like, it won't really matter, I deserve it, I'll only have one, it's been a long time. And the final thing in this part of kind of belief section is low frustration tolerance. I mentioned boredom as being a possible trigger. We have found that a lot of intensity addicts, which are porn, sex, chemsex, typically have a very low frustration tolerance. They get upset and frustrated really easily. And this is probably a long-term pattern, but this can also lead to kind of almost giving oneself permission to react and act out in a way. So learning patience, learning gratitude in order to kind of flip things over and get a little more positive perspective, learning to sit with uncomfortable feelings without having to react. All these are skills that we need to be constantly practicing as we move through recovery. Then there's two more, I think. One is the tyranny of shoulds, right? And I always ask my clients to beware of three words coming out of their mouths: should, always, and never. When we're using those terms, they're usually kind of they're black and white, they're definitive, and I think they're not always accurate. And so be careful. It shouldn't be so hard. I shouldn't have this problem. It's kind of the victim mentality, the what they call the fallacy of fairness. This isn't fair. Well, you're right, it's not fair, but are we gonna lose our sobriety over that? And so we have to kind of really work through some of these things. Yeah, but the world stinks. He or she shouldn't have spoken to me that way. All these things are just part of daily life, and we have to learn how to manage it and not react automatically or use it as an excuse, probably more accurately, to go out and use. And then two more. Really, the last one is next, and this really refers to the whole idea of the addiction cycle. But there's planning. So we've responded to triggers, cues, we've kind of rationalized it, we've gotten this far, and now we actually get into planning. And most relapses, especially with sex and porn addiction, take a little planning, and so clearing space, clearing the calendar, getting time, getting money, arranging people. So it's not like we don't know exactly what we're doing. And so I think at this point, though, our mind is made up in a way. And at this point, I know when I've had near misses in my own sobriety, I knew what I should do. I just didn't want to do it, right? I'd taken my will back. And so just being willing to surrender to that once again, despite this preoccupation phase. And by the way, the longer we stay on that, the more inevitable it becomes that we relapse. And then the fifth one on this backwards backward movement toward relapse is the acting out part, whatever that looks like for you. So I think these are really important because relapse, we talk about sometimes, in fact, in this webinar, people sometimes, especially partners, are discouraged that relapse is so common. And it is common. It doesn't, but my belief is it doesn't necessarily have to be. I think if people are really aware of their behaviors, monitor themselves, surround themselves with people who are going to call them out if they see these kinds of things, it doesn't have to be. So we don't have to go down those backward steps toward addiction. And with that, I think I'll stop. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, David. I'm a 12-step guy. I'm not hugely familiar with Smart Recovery. I've never been to a meeting. Can you explain the differences between Smart Recovery and 12-step recovery?
Yeah. So Smart Recovery is comprised of facilitated groups. So unlike 12-step, which is self-help, self-led, we elect a chairman and secretary and stuff. There's a trained facilitator who has to go through a course to be certified, and there's a workbook, and they accept really all kinds of addictive behaviors, but they really started out, and the main focus is on substance use. But why some people like it, I think it could be considered an asset or a deficit, is that a lot of Smart Recovery is really based on cognitive behavioral therapy, on kind of rational decision-making, beliefs, all very valid stuff. But what they don't include is anything to do with spirituality. And I think a lot of people, it's more in your head kind of talk. And I think, and that's, for some people, that's a good start. I think ultimately people need to kind of dig a little deeper in their recovery. Smart Recovery is very much an exercise of talking, and it's almost like a classroom. That said, they do have stuff. It's a little bit similar to dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT. They have a lot of skill sets, a lot of kind of decision trees and things like that to help people just increase their awareness. I think I've actually used for some clients Smart Recovery in addition to 12-step. I don't see them as polar opposites or adversarial. I think they can complement each other. I've seen some people also who just, for whatever reason, usually not logically based, but who refuse to go to 12-step program. I kind of use Smart Recovery as a foot in the door kind of thing and get them into the process, and then try to make a move toward 12-step, which I think is where they ultimately need to be. But Smart Recovery is found everywhere. They may even do stuff online now. I think during the pandemic, they moved more online, and they do some good skill building. Is what I think they're strong for.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. You mentioned one of the things we do, when you were talking about triggers, you mentioned one of the things we do is sometimes test personal control, which, never a good idea. AA has a saying, if you hang out in a bar, eventually you're going to have a drink. Actually, the saying is, you go to the barbershop every day, you're going to get a haircut.
Right.
And, the analogy is hanging out in the bar, you're going to drink. But we don't really need to test our personal control with sex addiction, because the world is filled with, not only internal triggers, but the external triggers, the images here, the billboards, the magazines, the TV shows, we sent out a newsletter, our weekly newsletter this morning, and it linked to an article on another website. And without our knowledge, that website had posted a couple of pictures that we would not have picked.
Right.
And they were highly triggering for a lot of the people who went there. We are going to get triggered as sex addicts, as betrayed partners. You are going to get triggered. How do we deal with that? Because this is, trigger is step one here toward relapsing. What can we do as addicts, and what can we do as betrayed partners when we're triggered? I mean, betrayed partners aren't going to relapse, but they're really going to struggle. Right.
I'll start by saying something that was clarified by you, actually, and it really was helpful for me. And that is that we obviously have to learn how to manage triggers. And in treatment, occasionally we have clients who complain about kind of being triggered by something. And actually, that's a very useful experience. We need to learn how to walk or ride or survive a trigger, right? Try to ride through it and understand that it can pass if we don't attach to it. It's practice, but it's practice in a safe environment. So I think, but you're absolutely right. We even in a safe cocoon like residential treatment program, people are going to get triggered. And that's not necessarily a bad thing in that environment. And it gives people practice in the skills they need to carry outside into the world, because as you say, especially with sex addiction, the triggers are everywhere. We can't just, the strategy in kind of old school addiction work is just avoid the triggers. Well, that's not easily done. In fact, it's frankly impossible with sex and porn addiction, or sex addiction at least. So what do we do? I think there's a number of things we can do. I think to first of all recognize them when they're happening. I always like to do a little bit of at least a cognitive kind of postmortem. What just happened? Did somebody say something to me? Did I have a feeling? Did I have a sensation? Like what was the cause of this? And sometimes it's something from the outside, a text from an affair partner or something, just out of the blue. But I think once that occurs, that awareness, we know something's going on, then we have to process it and deal with it and diffuse it, is the word I use. And you can do that in a number of ways. I think the best thing is to talk to somebody, right? If we are on our own trying to solve this problem without outside help, where it's kind of a closed universe and that we have limited resources. But as soon as we make a call, as soon as we can contact with somebody, we have somebody who's not being triggered at that moment, hopefully, and they can give us some feedback, so some objectivity, kind of help us ground ourselves. So reaching out is one thing, grounding ourselves is another, and there's lots of grounding techniques we've talked about here. The 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 senses grounding exercise, 4, 7, 8 breathing, all kinds of breathing, progressive relaxation. All that is also very useful to kind of interrupt the cycle, because we know that if we grab onto a trigger, it'll take us down the rabbit hole. And so the idea is to be aware of the trigger, monitor ourselves, control ourselves, and let the trigger wash over us and disappear. And yeah, we have to notice it, but we don't want to grab onto it. So I think reaching out, grounding ourselves, and then probably not so much in the moment, because it's more of a crisis moment at that time, but afterwards, when you're kind of safe somewhere, or you're back into an emotional safety, I think journaling, reflecting, meditating on it is really important to kind of process what just happened, and why did it happen, more importantly, and how can I prevent coming that close again in the future. So I think just really analyzing it post-mortem, but in real time, trying to deal with it, making calls, grounding ourselves, breathing, everything we can do to kind of maintain emotional regulation.
And just to reiterate one of the things you said, I personally believe it's important for addicts to get triggered when they're in a safe environment, because, I go to you and I are both alcoholics. I'm also a sex addict. But I go to my AA meetings and somebody will say, oh, I was in the liquor aisle and I saw my old brand of scotch. And immediately everyone in the room, we're all tasting our old brand of scotch, including me.
Exactly.
But I'm in a safe space. I'm not going to reward that trigger with a drink, or by wandering to the grocery store or the liquor store across the street from the AA room, which is both it's a bad choice of locations, but it works. I'm not going to reward it. And so the more times I get triggered and don't reward it, the less power for me that trigger has. Now somebody can mention my specific brand and I'm like, whatever. I still taste it, but I know I'm not going to act on it, because I've been through this 1,000 times already and not acted on it. I think the same is true with sex addiction. One of the things I like about the 3-second rule for sex addicts, I'm not sure this one works particularly for betrayed partners, but if I'm in line at the grocery store and there's somebody in front of me who's triggering, 1 second, second number 1, recognize I'm triggered. Second number 2, turn away, stop looking. Second number 3, think about something else or humanize that person. And that works, but sometimes it works for about 15 seconds and then I have to do it again.
Right.
And I can use that tool 4 or 5 times before the trigger is fully gone. But because I'm not rewarding it and repeatedly not rewarding it, I'm training myself to not reward it, and it loses power. So I do think it's important to be triggered, but I also think testing personal control is a really terrible idea.
Yeah, I know exactly. I realized I didn't say anything about partners being triggered, and I do want to address that for a second. I think equally, partners can equally be triggered by language, by thoughts, by something could be innocent, but because of the trauma that's a leftover from their previous experience, they kind of can interpret something and be triggered by it, even if it's not necessarily triggering. So what to do? I think a lot of the same things, to really reach out, and that's why we always really try to make sure partners have a robust support network themselves. just so they have people to talk to share their experience with, people who've been there, people who understand. And then also the emotional regulation techniques, the grounding techniques, the breathing, to be able to talk about stuff, to be able to share it and regulate, internally as well. So these are all, I think, valid for the partner as well. I think it's the specific triggers will differ. I think just because partners, I think, can be triggered by things that are perhaps more subtle in behaviors, a way somebody looks or acts or talks. So, all these things can be triggering. I mean, everybody's individual, and there's probably thousands of them out there for a lot of different people, but really the same techniques apply. And I think bottom line, if there's one thing you remember about that, I think is to not try to deal with this except in that moment, in those brief seconds right at that moment, by yourself, right? You need to talk about this with somebody and get help.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in the case of partners who are not necessarily at risk in those seconds when they've been triggered, they can maybe just go and make that call a little sooner and not have to worry about doing something bad. They may react emotionally, they might yell or and that's not uncommon, but that's not necessarily a great feeling either, because it's not very satisfying to the partner or the addict for that matter.
No relief for anybody with that, unfortunately.
No.
Let's jump into the Q&A feature. Type your questions into the Q&A. We got a couple here, but type them in. We'll get to as many as we can today. First question here. I'm currently seeing a therapist with my wife. I'm thinking I need to see a specialized therapist for porn addiction. Yes, you do. Could you recommend a therapist? Yes, we can. Click the contact us button on seekingintegrity.com, this one, or sexandrelationshiphealing.com, which is where we are now. Tell us you're looking for a CSAT, where you're located. Those emails go direct to my colleague, Tammy Berhouse. She knows pretty much every CSAT in the country. She can absolutely help you find a certified sex addiction therapist, which is what you need. David, can you explain why it's so important to have the proper therapist when we're dealing with sex and porn addiction?
Boy, indeed. And you and I have both seen a lot of kind of horror stories of people that end up with the wrong therapist. So there's two different kind of perspectives here. Traditional sex therapy, and both Dr. Rob and I are both sex therapists and CSATs, so we know both sides of this. But a lot of sex therapists who don't really understand addiction or sex addiction or porn addiction will take just really an unhelpful approach to the point of being what they call sex positive. And I'm sex positive too. Sex is a good thing, but they can say, well, this behavior, what's the problem, right? You're just kind of indulging in your sensuality or sexuality. They can kind of give permission for it sometimes, or misunderstand it, or misdirect it, or blame somebody inappropriately. It's just they just don't kind of understand the dynamics of addiction, and that can be really hurtful and harmful. So a CSAT, a certified sex addiction therapist, really has specialized training in understanding these addictive processes and recognizing that pornography and other forms of sexual acting out are just that. And they really meet all the criteria of addiction. We don't make moral judgments about bad behavior. We're looking at very specific criteria. Does this meet the criteria that we use, by the way, against any other drug or substance or behavior like gambling? It's all the same. And so we can measure this quite objectively. And it is an addiction. And unfortunately, at this point, most therapists are not equipped to deal with that unless they're CSATs. They just don't understand it.
Yeah, and we see this at the treatment center all the time in LA, and I see it in the online work groups. If I have 15 or 20 guys in a work group, at least 4 or 5 of them spent months or years and thousands of dollars with a therapist who was basically co-signing their addiction while their lives progressively got worse. Because, well-meaning therapists who were just not trained to recognize the real problem, which was addiction. So please do reach out to us, and we will help you find the correct therapist for you. Okay, this is the next one is a two-parter. Part 1, D-Day was 14 months ago. My husband is a sex and love addict in therapy. We have an in-house separation. I see his problematic patterns, withholding information, lying, but he is working on them. As a hobby, he plays music in bars where he would, in the past, defend his flirting, saying he had to be friendly. Before I learned of his addiction, I accepted this, but now I realize it's part of his acting out. At my request, he has not taken any gigs since D-Day, but he has recently been asked to play at a house party. Part two, I won't attend the house party as I'm still traumatized and can't socialize much, but I am in therapy. I feel uncomfortable with him playing or even going while still figuring himself out and in active recovery. He is making me feel guilty and unreasonable for asking him to decline, as playing music is important to him. I find it interesting that he rarely plays unless he is preparing for a gig or there is an audience. Do you have any comments or advice for us? Interesting question.
Right. So I guess, we were speaking earlier about testing our control, testing ourselves, and this might be a situation, going back into an environment where there's potential triggers and the behavior that obviously is triggering to the partner as well, who framed the question here. It's hard for me to say exactly what you should do or make a specific recommendations, but I think it's really important to understand what's involved. I'm talking about the addict here in terms of the potential triggers, and I understand the need for that. I don't want to say need, but I think the desire for that can be a nice part of someone's recovery if music is a part of their life. Maybe there's ways to make it safer. Maybe there's ways he could take another recovery brother with him to be there. Maybe there's some accountability that can be built in to the event so he can do it, but it would be safe, or at least safer, by having some people around that could mitigate any danger or risk. So that's the only thing I can think of if he decides to do it, to kind of reduce the harm that might be caused by it. Now, I would also, and I'm glad you're speaking up about your concern for this, because that's a very legitimate concern. And I think you guys have to have a talk and to see. This is not an unusual situation with couples where you have differing opinions, different needs, different wants. And so it's some kind of figuring out what's the middle ground there. I think if you guys have a therapist or a couples therapist, this would be maybe a nice conversation to have with a third party where you can kind of negotiate or talk about or even express your needs. I know sometimes addicts are really bad at expressing their needs. They may not be clear on them. They may not be able to articulate them very sophisticated way. So I think just having somebody to kind of talk about this, lay it all out, and see, okay, what's the reality here? How can we, if it's going to go forward, how can we make it safer? And also, how can we honor or respect the anxiety this causes for the partner when this is happening? And what can we do about that to reduce that or help that? And so those are the questions I would ask. How you actually answer those, I think, should be a process that maybe you and your therapist go through. But this is one of those real life scenarios that's very legitimate, and I understand the need to go back into certain environments, and it sounds like he's made a decision not to do that till now. But this is one of those moments where are we moving toward recovery in a new way, or are we kind of moving backwards, and that kind of thing that we talked about earlier tonight. So I would just take those questions to a CSET and see if you can work it out and find your answers.
Yeah, and if I was talking to him about this and he was insistent on going, I would make sure that he bookended it with, his 12-step sponsor or his therapist or somebody. I'm going to call you before I go. Here's my plan for staying sober. I'm going to call you when I leave. We'd probably stay on the phone until I get all the way home. I would encourage him to take somebody with him who's in recovery to keep an eye on him and run interference if need be. There needs to be a plan. Sometimes there are things that are triggering that we simply cannot avoid in recovery. This is one that theoretically could be avoided, but there are destination weddings of when it's your daughter or at the beach, and you pretty much have to go, even though it's the beach. Weddings in general are triggering. So again, it's okay to be triggered. It's not okay to act on those triggers. But if triggers can be avoided in early recovery, they probably should be. The world is triggering enough. So yeah, like David said, this is one of those real world things. It's like, it's 14 months. Can I start playing music? I don't know. It's a very individual thing. So yeah. Next one here, my sex, love, porn addict partner keeps being emotionally abusive calling me the narcissist, pointing out my flaws, swearing at and calling me names, all while breaking promises to me and saying he's not. From my own work, I know this is manipulation, deflection, gaslighting, etc., and that I'm not responsible for his choices. Even though I know this, why does it still hurt so much? Why can't I just detach?
Well, to bring in Dr. Rob's concept about codependence, with the idea of which is that, you know, partners love each other, couples love each other, and they care about that. And I think to ask someone, and this may be one of the flaws of the old codependency concept, just to ask someone to detach is kind of going against all our whims, and it's not, I don't think necessarily the answer either. I think when we love someone and care about them, I don't know if that's pathological. I don't think it is. So yeah, I understand the need, though, to not be reacting and living in these feelings all the time, and that's causing you discomfort. And so the any kind of disconnecting or detaching would be for your benefit. What I would like to frame it as in a different way, maybe, is boundaries and really understanding that his behavior is, and I think you do, from your question, understand this cognitively, that this is not your fault, that this is his really, I think, kind of on that backward slide we were talking about. When we see these behaviors of deflecting, gaslighting, and blaming, and those are bad signs. Those are the kind of the things that we talk about on the road to relapse here. And so I think that's what the real problem is, and that's what he needs to address. Hopefully, I don't know if you said he's in therapy, but hopefully he is, where he can be confronted on this a little bit. But I think, you know, it's going to hurt, and I think I'm not saying you have to stay there and live mired in that pain, but I think it hurts because you care, and that's not on its face a bad thing, right? What I think you need to do, though, is create an environment that's emotionally safe for you, and that, I think, the best way I know to do that is boundaries, and boundaries would be on this behavior and having consequences. You know, if he continues to blame and gaslight and manipulate and all that stuff, I mean, that's not something that you can live with, and you have to decide what that means for you, how that looks. But I think you don't really have control over him except by creating some safety for yourself, and hopefully he'll react accordingly. But yeah, the question, why is it so hard to, it's painful. And
Yeah.
And I think part of it, I've seen people feel better the more they can kind of connect with people outside the family system. If you have friends and support systems, you can talk about this and get other people's opinions, share their perspectives, other people who are going through the same thing. That can really be helpful too, to just kind of take the sting out of it. But ultimately, something has to change, and he has to change, frankly, and that might be assisted by boundaries, maybe not, and then you have another choice to make. But I think setting boundaries about what you need and what you're going to put up with is going to be really important.
Yeah, and you know, I think, David, you'll agree with this. These denial behaviors, the gaslighting, 99% of the time, the addict isn't even aware they're doing it, because the lies and the manipulation starts in their own head, and they believe it before it ever comes out of their mouth. And unfortunately, betrayed partners are not the person they're going to listen to when they need other addicts. They need a trained therapist. They need a sponsor to say, you're lying, you're full of crap, you know. Then they can hear it. They don't hear it from the betrayed partner very well. They do hear it from other addicts really well. This is why group treatment settings work so well. You know, like inpatient, we have the first major task is breaking through denial. Even in our online work groups, the first major task is breaking through the denial. You know, learning to recognize your own lies and the secrets you're keeping, and the way you manipulate others, the way you manipulate yourself. I feel your pain. You know, when somebody that you love does this stuff to you, how can it not hurt? I mean, but it does mean you love him. So that's good news, I think. So,
And you know, and I think this is understood because you have a lot of insight when you pose this question. But you know, hopefully you have your own support system as well, and your own therapist you can process the stuff with, because not that there's anything wrong with you, but you need the support
Right.
to go through this.
Yeah. Yeah. Addicts don't need support. They deserve it. Or betrayed partners, don't need support. They're not the one with the problem, but they deserve support because they've been hurt. So yeah, sorry, I phrased that backwards earlier. My husband had a wake-up call in what I think they call having the fog clear and realizing the destruction that's present in the family, and he started crying. I was supportive of him, even though I felt resentful that he has been in a happy fantasy land all these years. And then all these years when I had been telling him the destruction and leaving, and him leaving me with the messes to clean up. A few days later, he completely stopped all recovery work, and it showed. His therapist stated he was in a place of self-pity. I'm just wondering how long that usually lasts. And other than giving him the gift of hopelessness, time and space, he is doing the work again, yet it doesn't feel authentic, but rather just doing it to stay in the relationship. Is there something you would recommend? So moment of clarity, crying, stop doing the work, but is now doing it again, but it doesn't feel authentic.
So these moments of clarity, or I call them teachable moments,
Yes.
they're when the addict really can, where the fog lifts momentarily, right? And that often happens after, at the end of the addiction cycle, for example, after people act out, there's shame and remorse, and that's sometimes a window of opportunity to kind of break through. This person's already in their work, so for whatever reason, he had a reaction against it. I think that there's that vulnerability that is extremely difficult for a lot of addicts to experience and display. So he was obviously vulnerable there, feeling stuff, and I think probably he reacted to that. And this is something we see in treatment too, where people will often based on other people in like a group being vulnerable, people kind of get in the moment. It's a little bit contagious when people do that, and they'll open up, and then there's often a kind of a rebound effect. It's like, oh my God, what did I just do? And they close up again in a reactive kind of way. And it sounds like that's what's going on here. I think do you say if he's in therapy? I don't know. What I think would really be
Yes, he is.
Okay, so it'd be very useful. I think this is great material for some therapeutic sessions to deal with what just happened and what's going on and what's the feeling that came up that you are running so hard away from. And I think really to explore this in depth with somebody. And again, as Scott said, probably the partner is probably not the best person to have these conversations with, because he's just going to react. And he's closed off now. I think somebody like a therapist, maybe a sponsor, but I think a therapist would be better to kind of call him out on this, and more than that, not blame, but to explore. Because I'll tell you, this place of self-pity and victimhood, it doesn't necessarily have an end date on it. It can go on a while until something bad happens, basically, because that self-pity is one of those attitudes that really keep us moving on that backward trek toward relapse. So I think working on this stuff with a therapist would be really helpful, because I think what happened, he got vulnerable, it freaked him out, and he's closed up again. Now, you see, he's back in work, doesn't feel authentic, so that's good. I mean, he's back there. But I have also seen a lot of people go through therapy, kind of checking the boxes, but never really going very deep. And hopefully his therapist will help him go a little deeper on this, because this is the kind of situation where just going through the motions without really applying oneself and being vulnerable in that process, in the therapy process, is not going to be very effective. So I do hope he can, and his therapist maybe needs to give him a little push to get back on track.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, addiction is a fantasy land. That's the appeal of addiction. It's a fantasy land where, I don't have any stress. I don't have any anxiety. I'm not ashamed to be me, like I'm a cool guy all the time. And this is why we turn to our addiction. We use it to escape things like stress and anxiety and shame. And, and we do it even though we're leaving destruction in our wake. We stay in the fantasy land because we don't want to feel pain. And we never learned how to feel pain or process it in a healthy way. We learned how to escape pain. Um, he had the moment of clarity is when the pain comes rushing through. And I think it's fairly normal after that for the addict to immediately like say, nope, 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 throw the wall back up. Maybe they don't act out, but they're sure as bleep not going to feel anything for a while. I'm thrilled that he's back doing the work. Bring the body, the mind will eventually follow. And once the mind gets there, the heart will eventually follow. But yeah, I mean, sometimes there's checking boxes, and he should have a conversation about, am I checking boxes? Am I really trying? What's going on here? Am I so shut down that it looks like it's not authentic, even though I'm really, there could be there's just a lot going on.
Yeah.
And early recovery it's hard because for the first time, sometimes in 20, 30, 40 years, an addict is having feelings, and we don't handle it very well. Everything is overwhelming. And it's tough. So I applaud you for hanging in there.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah. You were going to add something there, David? Or
I was just saying it's also confusing, right? In that time with feelings, like people don't know what am I feeling, which sounds silly, but it's true. I mean, most addicts, when I got sober, I just kind of felt bad, but it was like learning a new language. Okay, this is how sad feels. This is how lonely feels. This is how angry feels. It was all new in a way.
Yeah, and we've talked about feelings here. We give everybody the feelings wheel when they get to treatment so they can look at it and point. We also, David's big on somatic stuff, what's happening in your body, because, stress lives somewhere, and anxiety lives somewhere, and fear lives somewhere, at least in my body. If I can pick the part of the body that's struggling, I can usually figure out what I'm feeling. But in early recovery, it's just, I haven't felt in 25 years. I don't know what to do with it.
Right, exactly.
Okay. As a betrayed spouse, I struggle to understand sex addiction. And I hope I don't offend, but one side of my brain is like, this is just him having fun. Is the act itself still fun for sex addicts? Or do I not understand how they engage in activities, but they didn't want to? Oh, this is a good question. David, is sex addiction fun?
I think if you talk to a lot of sex addicts, maybe at one point in their career, it was exciting. It was intense, and maybe it was even fun. But I think after a while, the compulsive aspect of the addiction, the drive, the numbing part of it, the constant escape into fantasy, the consequences. I mean, for a lot of time, it's not fun after a while. And I think that's one misconception, is that there's I think people who engage in sex and porn addiction are really, it's an escape mode. They're kind of trying to get away from feelings and avoid stuff rather than going toward something. What they're going toward is a distraction. Yes. And they've really misappropriated sex and the brief dopamine hit we get from it and the feel good part of it into a way to self-medicate when they're feeling uncomfortable, when they're feeling bored, when they're feeling angry. I mean, all of that gets, and very much building on the question we just had about not feeling anything, it's a way to deal with it. And so I just think, probably in the beginning, maybe it was exciting, but I think I'd like to talk about sex and porn as intensity addicts, meaning they're going for the dopamine and adrenaline that goes with it. And after a while, that is even pleasure. It feels almost like a compulsive drive to get that to just feel normal. And this is true of any addiction, because we have tolerance, meaning that the dopamine that gives us a little feel good reward, if you will, from these behaviors. After a while, we get used to a certain level of stimulation. We need to do more. We have to up the ante. We have to escalate to continue to feel good. And at some point in a fully developed addiction, we're using to not feel good so much as to feel not bad or normal. This is really
feel
clear.
Less.
Yeah, exactly. The substance users. I'm an alcoholic, right, in recovery, but when I was drinking at the end, I wasn't having fun. I'm not even sure I got drunk. But if I didn't drink, I got sick. And so I think, you know, at some point the addiction kind of becomes this beast that we kind of can't live with and can't live without, and it becomes very problematic. Scott, I'd be
Yeah.
curious about what you have to say about this.
Oh yeah. I mean, sex is fun. Sex addiction is not fun because sex addiction is not about sex. Sex addiction is about escape. And David mentioned tolerance. There's a whole lot of neurochemistry happening. And we end up just kind of chasing the tail of the dragon, just trying to not feel horrible. I mean, it's this addiction is all about escaping my feelings, because I don't know how to handle them and they all feel overwhelming. And yeah, it's not about having fun. It's not about feeling good. It's about feeling nothing. Um, yeah. So, but it starts out fun. It did for me anyway. And I can understand why a betrayed partner is like having these questions. Like, isn't he out there just getting his jollies? And, because that's what it looks like. But if it's really addiction, that's not what's happening. You know, so,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's helpful. I hope it is.
Yeah. Great question.
I love this next one too, David. Can love addicts actually love in their primary relationship? And let's just say sex, porn, love addicts in general, actually love in their primary relationship.
Yeah, boy, another great question. You know, what is love addiction or romance addiction, right? What it is basically at its core is an addiction to the brain chemicals that we get when we fall in love with somebody. And sex therapists call that limerence, but we get a lot of oxytocin, a kind of bonding hormone, some other hormones that kind of soothe, make us feel good, give us a bit of a high. It's not quite the same as the adrenaline and dopamine side of the intensity addicts, but it's more of a kind of a satiation kind of feeling. So is it real? Yeah, it feels real. But love addicts also fall in love with the fantasy of the person, not the person themselves. So it's most intense often in the very beginning when they know very little about the object of their romantic attraction, but they make it up. It's their fantasy and they imagine life with this person, but it's not the real person in front of them. And much the way the sex addict objectifies somebody, that a love and romance addict will often fill in the gaps they don't know about the person yet. And then as the relationship progresses, the more they learn about the person with their foibles and their flaws and all that, it starts to break apart a little bit. And our body regulates. So the oxytocin that's providing the high, after a while, just kind of adjusts and we don't feel it anymore. And that's often the end of the attraction and the love in that relationship. So to your question, it's an interesting one. Can love addicts actually attach, I guess, in a way that's authentic and viable and more permanent? And I have seen that happen, but I think it has to move from the addictive kind of limerence state to a more authentic emotional connection. We have, for our sex addicts in recovery who are single, we talk about a dating plan, which is the opposite of kind of the addiction part, which is where you get to know the person first. You go on a coffee date or meals and movies, then maybe have sex. But unlike sex addiction, where you're just kind of going just for the objectified fantasy and the body, really, this with the dating plan, you sort of make an emotional connection and build. I think with a love and romance person, if they can do the same thing and really get to know the person and form authentic attachments, that's what's going to make a relationship persist. I think if it's just based on that kind of love and romance stuff, it's kind of a lot of fluff that very easily just kind of disintegrates. And so I'd be cautious about that. But can a love and romance person develop an authentic relationship? Well, yeah, but if it's based on the fantasy and the oxytocin and the limerence, I have my doubts. But if they can also learn to create a relationship that's based on more authentic reality, then yeah, of course.
Yeah, and I think the more general version of that with addicts is addicts often love to the best of their ability. But that ability, does that mean they actually love you or not? I mean, when the going gets tough, we get drunk, basically. And relationships are not all about that limerence fantasy where everything is perfect. Even the stuff that's going to be really annoying later, it's just cute and fun now. So if I'm in that high, and I mean, limerence is a neurochemical high, similar to what we get with drugs or sex addiction or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah.
If I'm high, am I really loving? And then if we get past that high and I stick with you, even though I'm sneaking around and having other relationships, because that's what love addicts do. Do I love you? I don't know, maybe to the best of my ability, but my ability is definitely stunted by the addiction. Do you agree with that, David?
I do. And then when I was talking about, yeah, it can happen, that's with some work, right? And really creating a relationship that's not based on the dynamics of like a love and romance addiction, which is a very different thing.
Yeah. And by the way, limerence is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. Limerence is when we meet somebody new, it helps us want to bond with them. It keeps us together long enough so that we can develop the deeper, more meaningful bonds if they're going to happen. So limerence serves a real evolutionary purpose for us. It helps us pair bond.
Oxytocin, which is the drives limerence, is what happens when a woman gives birth. Both she and the baby, and by the way, the husband, the father, I should say, all the oxytocin goes really up through the roof, and it's nature's way of like speeding along a bonding of the newborn and the parents. But that's the same chemical that's going on in love and romance addiction, and we kind of fall head over heels, but not so much with the person, but with the high that goes with it and the fantasy of the person.
Yeah. This next question, what do I do with the unexpected breast shot? I'm going to change the language there on a TV show. I'm not getting triggered, but my wife is. By the way, this is what happened with our newsletter that we sent out this morning with the pictures on the website that wasn't ours. There was an unexpected shot, and the addicts weren't getting triggered, but boy, the betrayed partners were getting triggered. I don't want my husband seeing this. I don't blame him. But what do we do with this when there is this unexpected external trigger, and the world is full of this? I mean, you click the channels on the TV, boom, there it is. And often it is, the addict is doing what he's supposed to do, which is usually like looking away, using the 3-second rule if he needs to. Meanwhile, the wife is getting triggered, and then she's noticing him looking away, and she's getting more triggered because he has to do this. And it can become this vicious cycle just because you were watching TV together. So what do we do with this, David?
Boy, you're right. And I think this is one of those things like we talked earlier tonight about some triggers we just can't avoid, even though we try sometimes like this, right? We don't put ourselves in dangerous places, but here it is in our living room showing up. And so I think the best we can do is, first of all, break the attention, like you just said, although that's not really what the partner is experiencing here.
Right.
It's a traumatic response based on old patterns and hypervigilance and kind of noticing everything and interpreting everything through an addictive lens. And so I think really to talk about it, to process it is the best I can say. I think we talked earlier tonight about taking care of ourselves when we're triggered in terms of breathing, emotional self-regulation, calling somebody, talking about it. All those tools I think would be effective here too. It's just one of those unfortunate things that happens, and it's, by the way, for the partner, this is a normal response, as Scott said, not something that's unusual, because these patterns they're hyper vigilant to signs of trouble, and here it is, although the husband had nothing to do with it at this point. So I guess I'm not sure I can say more than just talking, grounding. Scott, do you have suggestions on more concrete things to do?
Well, I think it's important for addicts to recognize betrayed partners. There's research. Betrayed partners almost all exhibit symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, whether they're doing it long enough to get an actual diagnosis or not. Hypervigilance, they're easily triggered. The mood swings, they can go from happy to off the charts, angry or afraid, and like that, basically on any trigger. And what happens with post-traumatic stress disorder is, I get triggered and it feels like the whole thing, all of it is happening all over again. So even though this is just an unexpected shot on TV that you weren't looking for as an addict, to the betrayed partner, it feels like you were looking for it. It feels like you're going hog wild with the cheating right now. And this is the post-traumatic stress response. It brings it all back up. And if they had any trauma before you, relational, it brings all that back up. So sometimes you're paying for crimes you didn't even commit. And you know, when you marry somebody, you get the whole person. And when you cheat on them, you create this post-traumatic stress. So even though it may feel like an unreasonable response to you as the addict, it isn't. And I think it's really important for you as the addict to understand she is responding in a fairly normal way for a betrayed partner. As you know, even though this shot on TV has nothing to do with me, it's very upsetting to her. And I need to let her be upset. You can show some curiosity. You can show some empathy if you're able. I understand this was triggering for you. And the reason it's triggering is because of things I've done in the past. And if you want to be brave, say, can you tell me what you're feeling and why you're feeling it? I really want to know. I want to feel your pain with you. That's the super healthy thing to do, but it's also the super brave thing to do. And it's also the hard thing to do because you may not get the response you want. But yeah, this is part of
just from the point of the partner here, I think I want to say, and you laid it out beautifully, Scott, with what trauma does, because it's in the midbrain, and it doesn't, they talk about it as having no windows and no clocks. So when something like this image appears on TV, like Scott described, everything comes rushing back as if it's happening right now again. And that's trauma. And so I would just urge the person, sometimes time helps this, but often the best solution for this is actually some kind of trauma therapy with your therapist, like EMDR or something, or you can process these feelings and put them to bed in your midbrain so that every time an image comes on the TV, you're not having to react as if it's all happening again. And that's trauma, and that can be helped with
and all kinds of trauma do this. They trigger the midbrain, which is the feelings, part of the brain, and they sort of disconnect the midbrain from the prefrontal cortex, which is executive reasoning, where you could say, oh, well, it's just TV. He didn't mean that.
We're not thinking clearly when that happens.
No, that part of the brain, when we're in trauma, that part of the brain shuts down. It's just poof, gone. And until we calm down, it's not coming back online.
You're entirely emotionally driven at that point when you're triggered.
Yeah, and this is where all the grounding techniques and things that David talked about earlier come into play. So we are out of time. We're also out of questions. So we did well today. Thank you, everybody, for being here. David will be gone next week, but Tammy will be filling in. So you'll get Tammy and I next week. And we look forward to seeing you. David will be back with us in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks. So you get 2 weeks of me and Tammy, and then David will be back. So enjoy your trip.
Thanks, Scott.
David's doing a book tour, I believe.
Yeah, I'm doing an ITOP symposium this week, and then a book tour. My book has been translated into German. So Berlin, Munich, and Vienna, here I come. So it'll be fun.
All right, everybody. Thank you for being here. We'll see you soon.
All right. Take care, Scott. Bye-bye.